Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the starched collar, corset-squeezed world of Victorian social rules, a place where even your sneeze had to follow protocol, and the simple act of offering your arm could be a scandal in waiting. Picture yourself in a gaslit London street, gloved hand resting delicately on a parasol, as the world judges your every twitch turn, and how crisply you nod at someone passing by. This isn't just old-timey manners. It's social survival in a time when politeness could make or break your life. And spoiler, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step out your front door and immediately realize you're already under scrutiny. A neighbor across the street clocks your shoes. Are they polished? Laced just so, one scuff and your reputation dips. Victorian society was rigidly obsessed with appearances, and public manners were its front line. The idea wasn't just to behave, it was to signal constantly that you belonged to the civilized. Even something as basic as walking had rules. A gentleman never strode ahead of a lady unless the sidewalk was narrow, in which case he did lead, but only by a fraction. He always walked closest to the curb to protect her from splashes. But if he overcorrected and blocked her from view, rude. And you, dear listener, just failed your morning stroll. Greeting others was a whole curriculum. You don't simply say hello, you execute a calculated bow or curtsy based on the other person's social standing, gender, and proximity. A slight nod for a stranger of equal status. A deeper bow for someone above. Never bow too low unless you're begging forgiveness, which in Victorian Britain you often were. Sneezing. Oh yes, that too. A discreet dab with a handkerchief. Loudness is vulgar. Forget to turn away and you're practically a public health menace. Remember, this is the same society that believed fainting in public was elegant, but blowing your nose audibly was scandalous. Historians still argue whether such rules helped unify Victorian culture or merely alienated the lower classes who couldn't keep up. And God forbid you run into someone while chewing. Chewing in public was barely acceptable unless you were at a formal dinner, and even then you must do it silently. No lip smacks, no teeth showing. The Victorians didn't invent food shame, but they perfected it. Now the umbrella. A gentleman never carried a dripping umbrella into a room. He hands it off before crossing the threshold. A lady. She never even carries one herself unless she's without escort. Speaking of which, women were expected to always be escorted in public, unless they were widowed, and even then they had better walk fast, eyes down. Here's a quirky one. Do not glance into someone's upstairs window while walking past. That was considered grotesquely impolite and bordering on scandalous voyeurism. Victorians were weirdly obsessed with privacy and yet built entire lives around being visibly correct. Let's say you bump into an acquaintance. You tip your hat not too high, not too low, touching the brim for someone you know, while removing it entirely for someone of higher status or a lady. Oh, and your hat must be held a certain way when off your head, not floppy, not too stiff, preferably at your side. Get it wrong, and congratulations, you've embarrassed your entire family. Even dogs weren't exempt. Walking a large, boisterous dog in public, not ladylike. The proper dog for a lady was a lap dog, and it should sit quietly in your arms, not sniff lampposts. But here's where it gets weirder in some parts of upper-class London. It was considered charming for a child to walk a dog, but only if the child wore gloves and didn't let the dog lead. Modern historians still debate whether all these behaviors emerged purely from class anxiety, or if they served as a kind of unspoken national identity holding the empire together, one etiquette rule at a time. It's hard to tell where the stiff upper lip ends and the neurosis begins. Now imagine you trip, just a little stumble. That could be interpreted as drunkenness, illness, or worse, moral weakness. A man might be whispered about at the club, a woman unmarriageable. The social implications of a misstep were sometimes worse than a broken ankle. And let's not even get into laughter. Too loud, and you're uncouth. Too frequent, you're unserious. A lady should titter softly behind a gloved hand. A man can chuckle, but only if the joke is tasteful. You're starting to see the exhausting chess game of this world right. You haven't even gotten to the marketplace or dinner or church yet, and already your nerves are fraying. Your back aches from standing so rigidly upright. Your hands cramp from the polite folds they must maintain, and you haven't even smiled properly all day because showing teeth still up for debate. You're a woman in Victorian Britain, which means your every breath is a performance. Not for applause, mind you, but for survival. Every blink, every button, every syllable is judged. You are expected to glide through life with grace, intelligence, but not too much virtue. Definitely a lot, and beauty without ever mentioning it. Basically, you must be seen, not heard, unless you're playing piano. That oddly is fine. Today, you wake early, not because you want to, but because propriety demands you be up before the servants, so they can knock, politely pretend they didn't hear you snore and help you dress. Yes, help. Because the corset you're about to wear requires at least one strong and emotionally distant person to lace you in. The corset itself is a Victorian miracle of social control. Its physical function is to cinch your waist, improve your posture, and keep you from doing anything wild, like breathing deeply. Its symbolic function, to keep you modest, literally squeezing you into shape. You're not supposed to run, shout, or bend in public. Why? Because your clothes don't let you. And God help you if your skirt lifts in the wind. Historians still argue whether women's fashion was meant to protect virtue or simply trap it in 14 pounds of crinoline. Either way, you'll develop a skill for walking slowly and calculating wind speeds on instinct. Your goal today, be charming, but not flirtatious. That's a tightrope made of silk thread and Victorian hypocrisy. A single too long gaze could imply scandalous intentions. A smile in the wrong direction could ruin a courtship before it begins. And once ruined, well. Victorian society doesn't believe in second chances, especially not for women. Reputation is everything, and reputations like glass parasols shatter easily. Let's talk conversation. You're allowed to speak, of course, just not about politics, or business, or money, or bodily functions, or if we're being honest, anything interesting. Acceptable topics include the weather, recent charity events, church sermons, and perhaps, if you're feeling bold, the last floral arrangement you admired. Even then, be careful. Mention lilies in the wrong tone and someone might think you're talking about funerals. Or worse, fertility. Still, conversation is expected of you. You must be agreeable, witty, but never sarcastic, and laugh just enough to flatter others without seeming too forward. One historian wrote that Victorian ladies were taught to smile often, but never with teeth. Imagine learning to weaponize your own face just to survive tea. Now imagine being alone with a man. That's not a date, it's a scandal. Victorian rules decreed that unmarried women must always be chaperoned in male company, no matter how innocent the situation. That includes walks, carriages, even sitting in a parlor, with the door slightly ajar. Why? Because closed doors equal temptation, and temptation equals ruin. Here's a quirky detail. Women were encouraged to learn French, but not enough to read the naughty novels. Just enough to order in restaurants and look delicate. Languages were like fashion, useful, but dangerous if you handled them too well. Want to work. Sorry. Upper-class women don't. Middle-class women may teach piano or paint miniatures just enough to earn pin money, never an income. Ambition is unseemly. Intellect is a threat. You read novels, not newspapers. And definitely not Darwin, unless it's in secret with the curtains drawn. Historians still debate whether women's silence in this period was imposed externally or internalized over generations. Either way, the result was the same. You learn not to speak unless spoken to. And even then, cautiously. Even your handwriting is judged. Letters from a lady must be neat, flowing, and emotional, but never passionate. That's a tricky balance, especially when you're writing thank you notes to a man you loathe, while pretending you'd be thrilled to see him at the next garden party. Now let's say you're a little older, perhaps unmarried. Victorian society has a convenient label for you, spinster. Your role is now to hover at the edge of every room like a well-dressed ghost, managing tea trays and providing moral support to younger, prettier cousins. But don't worry, you can still serve an important function by becoming a cautionary tale. There's an entire genre of etiquette guides dedicated to what women must not do. Don't laugh too loud. Don't argue. Don't walk too quickly. Don't linger at the window. Don't meet a man's eyes for too long. These guides were sold widely and updated constantly. So even if you somehow mastered all the old rules, new ones were always waiting to trip you up. Victorian society believed women should be ever evolving, just not on their own terms. And remember, your primary goal isn't happiness or knowledge or even health. It's marriage. But not love. Love is optional. Marriage, however, is your entire exit strategy from your parents' house. Fail to marry, and you'll either become a governess, read overworked and invisible, or the live-in relative who mysteriously never found the right gentleman. Funny how many of those women turn out to be well-read, fiercely intelligent, and possibly, just possibly queer. But of course, we mustn't say such things aloud. Historians still argue how widespread same-sex relationships were among Victorian women, given the cultural silence around them. But the coded diaries and passionate letters are telling. By the end of the day, your back aches, your corset pinches, and your jaw hurts from smiling. But you made it through without tripping, flirting, or fainting, though you came close. You are for another day a successful Victorian woman. Congratulations. Try not to breathe too deeply. Now let's flip the coin. You're a man in Victorian society. Sounds easier, right? More freedom, more respect, fewer corsets. But don't relax just yet. Because while women were expected to be paragons of virtue and restraint, you, sir, are expected to be a fortress of self-control and dominance with exactly zero margin for emotional error. Welcome to your own exhausting set of rules. You rise with the sun because sleeping in is lazy, and laziness is practically treason if you're a gentleman. Your morning begins with ritual, a cold wash, meticulous shaving, and tying your cravat just right. Not too flamboyant, not too loose. Historians still argue whether the rise of men's minimalist fashion was driven by practicality or just another way to express stoic control. Either way, your clothing must say, I am disciplined, I am trustworthy, I am never ever flustered. And above all, you must never flinch. The Victorian man is always composed. You do not cry. Not at funerals, not at weddings, not even at Dickens' novels, even though Bleak House is basically engineered to break your soul. A single tear might cast doubt on your business prospects or your suitability as a husband. Emotional expression is for women poets and the French. You're British. You endure. You're also expected to dominate conversations, but with elegance. You must be well-read, articulate, and subtly condescending. Never interrupt unless you're correcting someone. Never raise your voice unless you're toasting the Queen. And definitely never laugh at your own jokes that's low class. Instead, deliver dry wit with just the faintest curl of your mustache. Speaking of mustaches, yes, facial hair has rules too. The full beard, acceptable for rugged explorers and older gents. The curled mustache, popular but only if groomed daily with wax. No patchy beards, no unkempt sideburns. Remember, your face is your business card. Let's say you're heading to work. If you're upper class, that means managing estates or attending long lunches where other men smoke cigars, and gently imply that the Irish situation is rather complicated. If you're middle class, you're probably in banking, shipping, or running a shop. Either way, you must maintain a firm handshake, perfect penmanship, and never ever be caught gossiping. That's for the help. But here's the kicker. You are constantly watched. Not by the government, not by spies, by each other. Victorian masculinity is policed by your peers. Show too much emotion, weak. Care too much about fashion, foppish. Drink the wrong whiskey, uncultured. It's a 24/7 performance of subtle superiority and stone-faced respectability. And God help you if you're challenged. Even a minor insult at the gentleman's club might require you to respond with a duel, or at least an icy, well-worded letter. Dueling was on the decline by the mid-1800s, but the concept of defending your honor through confrontation lingered especially among the aristocracy. A real gentleman never lets slights go unanswered. He just does it with a smile, a Latin quote, and the implied threat of social annihilation. Here's a quirky one. Men were expected to take long, purposeful walks, but only in certain places. Strolling aimlessly was considered effeminate unless you were walking a specific route in Hyde Park, called the Row, where everyone else could see how impressively not lazy you were. Want to flirt? Be subtle, very subtle. You may offer a lady your arm. You may inquire about her health. You may mention the weather in her part of town. But direct compliments, too forward. Physical touch, absolutely not. Victorian courtship for men was like defusing a bomb while blindfolded and quoting Tennyson. Marriage, of course, is the ultimate goal. Not for love, don't be sentimental, but for social advancement. A good wife improves your standing. A bad match ruins it. And don't even think about remaining single past 40. That makes people suspicious. Confirmed bachelor was often code for a man who wasn't quite playing by society's rules, if you catch the drift. Historians still argue how much leeway elite Victorian men had behind closed doors. Publicly, you must be flawless. Privately, Let's just say many managed double lives. Affairs were tolerated so long as discretion was absolute. But scandal ruins everything. That's the cardinal sin in Victorian Britain, not the vice, but the visibility. Children. You must have them, but don't dote. That's the mother's role. Your job is to be an abstract symbol of order and legacy. You provide, protect, and pass down the family name. And then you go back to reading the Times in your study, ideally near a fireplace, and not near your children's emotions. Want to cry at your son's wedding? Too bad. Want to discuss your fears about aging or irrelevance? Repress it. Want to dance with abandon only if you're inebriated and among equals, and even then, mind the footwork. One fringe Victorian thinker even proposed that masculinity was a civilized restraint of animal instincts. Sounds noble. Mostly sounds exhausting. By the time you climb into bed still wearing your nightshirt socks and an entire layer of societal guilt, you're not sure who you actually are beneath all the layers of proper manhood. But it doesn't matter. You performed well today. You were dignified, stoic, and never flinched. That's what counts. Sleep tight, sir. Just don't snore. It's unbecoming. Class in Victorian Britain isn't just about wealth. It's about every gesture, vowel, shoe, and glance. It's the air you breathe, the way you hold your teacup, the lace on your cuffs, and the tone of your apologies. You can inherit a fortune and still be considered hopelessly low class if you pick up the wrong fork at dinner or say toilet instead of lavatory. Because in this society, class isn't just a system, it's a surveillance state. And tonight you're caught in the middle of it. Let's say you're middle class. That's a respectable place to be. You've got a house servants, maybe two, and a parlor you rarely use but always clean. You dress your children like miniature dukes and duchesses, even if your family income comes from bookkeeping or tea importing. But no matter how nice your waistcoat, the upper classes still smell the difference. You can try to pass, many did, but the rules are so subtle and shifting that one wrong move exposes you. Forgetting to offer your seat to a baronet's wife, unforgivable. Putting jam on top of your scone before cream, barbaric. Calling it a living room instead of a drawing room, social suicide. Historians still argue whether the middle class truly believed in the system or if they were just trying to survive it. What we do know is that manners became a kind of armor, one that had to be polished constantly or you'd be dismissed as common. Now if you're working class, the situation's even trickier. You likely live in a crowded tenement, share a water pump with 20 families, and don't have time to memorize the rules of formal letter writing. But still there's pressure. You may not be invited to balls, but you're expected to know your place at church, at work, even at funerals. A working class man might wear his best suit to Sunday service and still be judged for how he knots his tie. A domestic servant might practice her curtsy in private to avoid dismissal. A factory girl might save for gloves, not because she needs them, but because going gloveless in public marks her as loose. And loose is a life sentence in Victorian gossip court. Class is a cage, but here's the twist. It's also your ladder. If you're lucky, educated, and know how to perform respectability, you might climb. Just don't climb too quickly. Social mobility is allowed, but only if done gracefully, invisibly, and with deep respect for those already above you. You're expected to imitate, not innovate. Take speech, for example. Accent is everything. A dropped H can drop your status. The way you say bath or schedule might determine your job prospects. Elocution lessons were all the rage among the upwardly mobile. You'd literally pay to learn how to sound richer. And let's talk architecture for a second. because your house is expected to follow these rules too. If you're middle class, you better not decorate too lavishly, or someone might accuse you of putting on airs. Too plain, you're tasteless. Too ornate, you're vulgar. Even your wallpaper has a social class. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some Victorian etiquette manuals actually advised against laughing too loudly in your own home because thin walls might let servants or neighbors overhear and assume you'd had too much sherry. You couldn't even relax in your own drawing room without risk. Your children aren't safe either. From the moment they can walk, they're placed on the class treadmill. Boys are sent to schools that specialize in producing respectable young men with impeccable Latin. Girls are trained in music embroidery and knowing precisely how long to hold a teacup before setting it down. But class isn't just rules, it's ritual. Think of the season that stretch from spring to summer, when debutantes are paraded through London like prize ponies in silk. Each girl introduced to society with curtsies, white gowns, and absolutely no real say in her future. Just another performance. And if you're not invited, well, that says everything about your class, whether or not it's true. Even religion has class markers. High church Anglicanism, aristocratic. Methodism, respectable, middle class. Primitive Baptist, working class, grit. You're expected to believe whatever faith aligns with your fork set and wallpaper. Deviate and people start whispering. Clothing naturally is class warfare in fabric form. A silk dress on a duchess is elegance. The same silk on a barmaid's scandal. Victorian Britain worshipped the visual signs of class and feared what would happen if anyone faked them too well. The real terror wasn't the poor, it was the poor pretending to be rich. Some reformers tried to cut through it all, people like John Ruskin and Octavia Hill, who questioned the obsession with etiquette over empathy. But they were exceptions. For most Victorians, class dictated life, who you married, what you ate, where you lived, and how long you'd suffer in silence. So here you are, buttoned up, spine straight, voice cautious, praying your manners will protect you. But deep down, you know one slip, and you're no longer middle class respectable. You're just someone pretending. And in Victorian Britain, being a pretender is worse than being poor. It's tacky. It's easy to forget, until you live it, that in a Victorian household, you are never truly alone. Even when you're dressing, bathing, or sneaking a moment to exhale behind a velvet curtain, there's someone nearby. Watching. Judging. Taking notes in silence. Because the people who know the rules best are your servants. And tonight you've got an entire domestic army monitoring your manners. Let's start with your lady's maid. She's seen you half naked more than your husband has, and knows precisely how tight you like your corset, even if you lie about it. She can lace you up in under 10 minutes and remove a wine stain from imported silk in 5. But she also knows your secrets when you wept after the disastrous dinner party, when your letter to Mr. F smelled suspiciously of lavender, and when you claimed to have a headache just to avoid Sunday Mass. Then there's the butler, a human barometer of status and propriety. He stands like a silent pillar near the door, knowing everyone's name, title, drink preference, and recent scandal. He'll pour the sherry without spilling a drop, but miss a thank you, and he'll quietly inform the housekeeper that you're slipping. You may outrank them socially, but your staff sees everything, and that includes your etiquette slip-ups. Eat before the eldest guest is served. The footman notices. Use the dessert fork for your fish. The kitchen maid will snicker. Speak too sharply to your spouse at the table. Even the scullery maid downstairs will know by morning. Servants don't just run the house. They run the undercurrent of social correctness. Historians still argue whether their observations subtly guided behavior upstairs, or merely served as quiet punishment for those who forgot their place. But one thing is certain, no rule book could ever teach etiquette, like the eyes of someone watching you fold a napkin wrong. Now let's talk geography. In most respectable Victorian homes, there's a strict separation of space. Servants have their own staircases, passages, and doors. If you see one appear from the wrong direction, it's not a mistake, it's a scandal. Because the illusion of effortless civility must never be broken. The soup arrives hot, the flowers freshly trimmed, the fires lit just before you enter, but you're not supposed to see how. And then there's listening. Servants hear everything. That fight you had with your cousin about inheritance echoed through the thin walls. The confession you made after too much port filed away. Your daughter's whispered worries about Lord Percy's intentions, already analyzed and dissected in the laundry room. There's even a fringe Victorian tradition called below-stairs theater, where servants would act out the dinner conversations of their masters for entertainment, mimicking their accents, their gossip, their awful attempts at wit. So yes, you were probably roasted in the scullery before dessert had even cooled. Ever try to hide something from a valet? Good luck. That man irons your trousers, brushes your coat, and empties your pockets. He knows what you're reading, whether your watch is real gold, and how many brandy bottles you're actually going through. He's also likely the one ensuring your collar is the proper height for the season, which, by the way, is a thing. Collar heights changed frequently, and not keeping up was a sign you were either slipping socially or relying on outdated taste. And guess who makes sure you don't embarrass yourself at the club? That's right, your valet. He's your last line of defense between dignity and disaster. The hierarchy among servants themselves is its own miniature class war. The cook outranks the housemaid. The housekeeper has more power than most minor relatives. The butler, a god among mortals, unless your household is large enough to have a major domo, in which case the butler merely radiates stern authority from the dining room. And don't think your children are immune. The governess might seem demure, but she's a terrifying blend of teacher spy and moral enforcer. She's reporting every tantrum, every book read under the covers, every whispered question about how babies happen. Victorian children were raised under constant supervision, their social training starting before they could even form sentences. Want to break the rules, or go ahead. But your servants will notice, and worse, they might talk. Discretion was prized, but gossip was currency. A disgruntled maid dismissed without reference could tank your household's standing with one carefully placed anecdote at the grocer's. Historians still debate whether this omnipresent servant class shaped Victorian behavior more than etiquette books themselves. After all, those books could be ignored. But a frowning butler standing silently behind you, that's real-time feedback. And sometimes the rules were reversed. Servants had their own codes. A good maid never eats in front of the family. A proper footman stands perfectly still even during an argument. But break their codes and you might find your best gloves mysteriously scorched, or your tea accidentally steeped too long. Victorian revenge was always polite and usually floral scented. By bedtime, you're finally alone, or so you think. But somewhere just down the hall, your maid folds your nightgown. Your valet straightens your shoes. And the housemaid waits quietly to turn out the lamp after you climb under the quilt. In Victorian Britain, even your privacy has company. You want romance in Victorian Britain. How sweet. Just make sure you're fluent in handkerchief semaphore. Carry at least one symbolic flower at all times, and never ever touch the person you like. Because courtship here is not about spontaneity or passion, it's about code. Tonight you're falling in love Victorian style, and it's exhausting. It starts across a crowded parlor. You're sitting rigidly on a small embroidered chair, pretending to listen to your aunt recount the precise size of the bishop's garden, when suddenly you feel it. A glance. He's looking at you from across the room, not speaking, not smiling, just gazing. And that's all he's allowed to do. Welcome to Victorian flirtation so subtle it could be mistaken for a vision problem. A lady never approaches a gentleman. A gentleman never approaches a lady without an introduction. That introduction must come from someone of equal or higher status. And even then, the first conversation must be so boring it would make a tax form blush. You discuss the weather, the local rector's new fence, perhaps the quality of the music being played in the background, provided it's by a composer with a clean reputation. Say the wrong thing, make eye contact too long, or smile with your teeth, and the entire room will assume you're getting married. Or worse, having thoughts. Historians still argue whether this theatrical restraint was born of morality or simply designed to make courtship so difficult that only the most determined suitors survived. Either way, you've got work to do. Let's say you're the one hoping to receive attention. You'll need accessories because in Victorian romance, objects speak louder than words. A closed fan. You're uninterested. An open fan resting on the right cheek. Yes, I'm single. Twirling the fan slowly. You're thinking about someone. Dropping it on the floor. Bold. Possibly scandalous. Might mean I love you. Might mean I dropped my fan. That's the problem with a language no one formally teaches. Gloves also matter. You may drop one gently or accept help putting it on, but only halfway. Touching gloves is a serious step. Removing a glove in someone's presence, well, now we're practically engaged. Even flowers get involved. A red rose worn to the right says, I love you. Worn to the left, I am not interested. A yellow tulip, there's hope. A wilted lily. Leave me alone. It's a botanical minefield, and your survival depends on knowing your Victorian flora. And letters. Letters are love's battleground. You may not speak your feelings, but you can allude to them in perfectly phrased sentences peppered with scripture poetry and plausible deniability. A single word out of place, too affectionate, too familiar, too urgent, and you risk scandal. But get it right, and the reader may weep softly into their antimacassar and write back in equally tortured prose. Of course, everything hinges on chaperonage. You're never alone together. Even in the garden, there must be a relative, a friend, or a paid companion hovering just out of frame like a moral security guard. You may stroll at exactly 2 feet apart. You may sit briefly on opposite ends of a piano bench. But physical contact, absolutely not. And don't even think about speaking frankly. All feelings must be buried beneath layers of metaphor and implication. You look radiant today could lead to gasps. Your hat is becoming as daring. May I escort you to the refreshment table, be still my heart. There's a reason Victorian love letters are so long. It takes pages to say I like you without actually saying it. Here's a quirky detail. Some Victorian couples didn't even speak until their engagement. Everything was managed through third parties, formal visits, and prolonged silences. One popular method was the at-home card. A lady would announce the days she was receiving guests. A gentleman might visit during that time and spend 30 minutes discussing the weather with her father while occasionally sneaking glances across the room. Thrilling stuff. And proposals equally formal. A man must first secure the father's permission, usually over a painfully stiff conversation in the study. Then he may express his intentions to the lady, who will respond with either blushing silence acceptance or a carefully phrased rejection involving words like honor and regret. No surprises, no bending of the knee. No bended knee at all, actually. That would have been far too theatrical. Victorians feared drama the way modern people fear public Wi-Fi, but not all lovers followed the rules. Secret rendezvous did happen, usually in gardens behind hedges or during crowded public events when chaperones were briefly distracted. Letters were smuggled via footmen, poems written under fake initials, and some daring women, even brace yourself, initiated correspondence. Historians still debate whether these rebellious romances were more common than we think, or just rare enough to fuel decades of novels. But evidence suggests that for every rule follower, there was someone slipping a note beneath a doily and hoping nobody noticed. And when love did lead to marriage, the rules didn't stop. In fact, they intensified. Your betrothal was immediately subject to public scrutiny. Were your classes matched? Your incomes compatible? Was her dowry adequate? Did his family have a good name, even if Uncle Roger had that incident with the parrot and the French governess? It wasn't just about love. It was about alliance's status, survival. And once the vows were said, the courtship etiquette was replaced by an even longer rulebook: marital duty, propriety, dinner, hosting, child rearing. But that's for another section. Tonight your head is spinning. You've smiled just right. Dropped a glove, accidentally discussed the rain for 20 minutes, and blushed at all the proper moments. Maybe he'll write tomorrow. Just hope the letter doesn't end up in the hands of your maid first. Because as we've learned, the walls in this world always listening. You might think your biggest worry in Victorian society is keeping your gloves white or your reputation whiter. But no, the real danger comes from inside the house, or more precisely, inside your own body. Welcome to the age of moral panic, where science, superstition, and shame form an awkward, overly judgmental love triangle. Tonight, you're a bundle of nerves, because everything, your appetite, your posture, your thoughts, might be a symptom of degeneration. Let's start with your skull. No, really, because phrenology is all the rage. That's the pseudo-scientific belief that the shape of your head reveals your character. A lumpy forehead might suggest criminal tendencies. A smooth crown, perhaps you're too passive. Want to succeed, better grow a bump labeled determination. Entire careers were built and destroyed on head measurements. And don't get too confident if your cranium passes the test. The real battlefield is your behavior. You must be morally upright, hygienic, and disciplined in all things. Why? Because the Victorians believed vice was contagious. Literally. Bad habits spread like cholera, and no one wanted to catch your immorality. Here's a charming example for boys. Too much daydreaming was considered dangerous. You could be accused of masturbatory idleness, a phrase that no child should ever have to hear. The dreaded solitary vice was blamed for everything from poor eyesight to insanity. Parents were urged to monitor their sons' bedtime's posture and blank expressions, lest they were up to something unholy under the covers. And girls, they had to be watched, too. Too much reading could lead to emotional overstimulation, particularly if the books contained romance, suspense, or gasp foreign travel. A girl with opinions was a potential hysteric. One etiquette guide advised limiting piano practice to 30 minutes a day because vigorous musical performance can overexcite the womb. Yes, the womb. Historians still argue whether this was genuine belief or a polite excuse to keep women from showing too much skill. Now let's say you're unwell. Not sick, but just feeling a bit off. A touch of melancholy. Maybe a little anxious. Don't worry, that means you have neurasthenia. It's the fashionable diagnosis of the century. Caused by overstimulation, fast-paced city life, too much reading, or occasionally tight corsets. Symptoms include tiredness, anxiety, indecision, and a general sense that everything's just too much. Sound familiar? Treatment. For women, the infamous rest cure. No reading, no talking, no thinking. Just lying in a dark room and drinking milk. For men, more travel, beefsteak, and cigars. Victorian gender roles even affected how you were allowed to fall apart. And if neurasthenia didn't apply, perhaps your problem was moral imbecility. A diagnosis often slapped onto children who stole jam, asked too many questions, or displayed unnatural interests. What were those, art books, insects, feelings? The horror. Let's detour to the local asylum. You don't want to go there, obviously, but you should know what might get you committed talking to yourself, laughing at inappropriate times, or showing a sudden interest in vegetarianism. Seriously. One 1870s case involved a woman diagnosed with hysteria after refusing to eat mutton. Another, a man institutionalized for religious melancholy. The line between eccentricity and illness was dangerously thin. Even your daily habits were scrutinized. Take bathing. You must bathe, but not too often. Warm baths were thought to sap the body's vital energies. Cold baths were better character building, in fact. But linger too long and you might inflame your passions. Yes, soaking in a tub was considered potentially corrupting. Speaking of passions, passion itself was a threat. Passionate anything, speeches, opinions, kisses, was considered vulgar or even pathological. The goal was restraint. Always. Controlled breathing, soft voices, tightly fastened collars. Victorian society feared what happened when people let go. One fringe idea floated by moral reformers was that the human body had a limited supply of energy, sexual, emotional, intellectual, and using too much in one area would drain the others. So, if you were a poet, you'd probably make a terrible lover. And if you were an impassioned speaker, expect headaches and early death. Children didn't escape the panic either. They were trained like little moral soldiers. Don't fidget. Don't laugh too loud. Don't ask why the vicar smells like sherry. Victorian schools handed out demerits for inappropriate facial expressions. Emotional regulation was drilled into them before they learned multiplication tables. Even diet was moralized. Meat made you strong. Soup was ladylike. Spices suspicious. Chocolate was decadent. Tea was fine, but only if taken in moderation and without excessive giggling. And then came degeneracy, a word so vague and terrifying, it could mean anything from writing left-handed to enjoying theater too much. Degeneracy meant your bloodline was slipping, your morals were decaying, and your future children would probably be thieves. No pressure. So what do? You sit up straight, you drink your beef broth, and you pretend your recurring thoughts about running into the woods and shouting, "I hate lace," are completely normal. Because if you slip, if you twitch wrong, if you say the wrong word at dinner, someone might think you're unwell. And once that label sticks, the parlor doors begin to close one by one, until you find yourself alone sipping lukewarm tea, wondering how your skull ended up being the most dangerous part of your body. By now, you're properly paranoid about your posture, your passions, and your phrenology-approved head bumps. But don't worry, because you've got help. Or rather, you were help. Because in this chapter of Victorian life, you're not a grown-up at all. You're a child. And not the fun, muddy need kind either. You're a miniature adult in itchy wool, expected to obey curtsy and suppress your inner chaos at all times. Victorian childhood is a very specific flavor of controlled terror. From your first toddling steps, you're trained in how to be seen, but not heard. And even the seen part comes with conditions. Are you clean? Is your collar straight? Are your boots buffed to a nervous shine? Heaven help the child with a scuffed shoe on visiting day. You wake early not to watch cartoons or eat cereal on the couch, but to recite a moral poem. If you're a boy, it's probably about valor, diligence, and not slouching. If you're a girl, it's about humility, virtue, and needlework. Victorian children's books weren't for fun. They were sermons with illustrations. Every tale ended with either divine punishment or a paragon of perfection. No middle ground. You were either Little Lord Fauntleroy or a cautionary corpse. School. Oh yes, you go. But forget finger painting and free expression. Lessons are rigid rote and rule-bound. Writing must slant correctly. Your arithmetic answers must be silent unless asked. And if you're lucky enough to be in a school with a playground, don't expect to play in the modern sense. You're allowed to exercise, but only in ways that develop character. Tag is acceptable. Pretending to be a dragon, definitely not. And speaking of unacceptable laughter, children who laugh too much or too loudly are disciplined. Laughter hints at a lack of seriousness, and seriousness is everything. One etiquette manual even warned parents that excessive merriment in children may indicate future criminality. So next time you giggle, just remember you might be giggling your way toward jail. Mealtimes are no respite. You must sit straight, use the correct spoon chew silently, and never ever reach across the table. Elbows off, napkin in lap, eyes down. Ask before speaking. Don't ask more than once. And if you break the rules, no pudding for you. Or worse, you're sent to eat alone, which to a Victorian child is the social equivalent of exile. Then there's discipline. Oh, how the Victorians loved discipline. Corporal punishment wasn't just common, it was considered necessary. Teachers used canes, straps, rulers. Parents used switches and cold baths. Some inventive souls even believed in moral medicine tonics and pills to curb a rebellious nature. One popular formula contained alcohol, opium, and rhubarb. So if you were disobedient and sleepy all the time, it's probably because your discipline tonic knocked you half unconscious. Historians still argue whether Victorian parenting was truly crueler than previous eras, or just better documented. What's clear, though, is that expectations for children were unnervingly high. A 6-year-old was expected to write proper thank you letters. A 10-year-old might be tutoring younger siblings. And by 12, many working-class kids were already in factories or as domestic servants mastering the art of dusting without leaving fingerprints. Yes, class matters here too. If you're a middle-class or aristocratic child, your world is one of pianofortes, governesses, and speech elocution. If you're working class, your education may last just a few years before your tiny hands are needed in a chimney, a coal mine, or sorting through rags in a textile mill. Either way, your emotional needs are rarely a topic of concern. Victorian culture didn't believe in indulging childish feelings. If you're scared of the dark, you're told to pray harder. If you're sad, you're reminded of children in worse conditions, which, to be fair, probably included 95% of the planet. If you cry too much, that's a character flaw. Dry your eyes and scrub the steps. Even toys were moralized. Dolls weren't for imagination, they were for practicing motherhood. Toy soldiers taught discipline. Rocking horses. Perfectly fine as long as they didn't lead to wild inclinations. One 1850s parenting book warned against giving children kaleidoscopes because they encouraged idle staring. Yes, staring. And yet, beneath all the rules, something tender still pulses. A mother tucks a child in with a whispered hymn. A father presses a toy into a small hand before leaving for business. A governess, stern all day, allows 5 extra minutes of lantern light for secret bedtime reading. Because despite all the repression and fear of moral collapse, love still sneaks through quietly, carefully, like a smuggler with sugar in their pockets. Quirky side note: wealthy children were sometimes assigned animal companions for moral instruction. Not puppies. No, we're talking goats, donkeys, or even monkeys chosen for their lesson-teaching potential. A goat teaches responsibility. A monkey teaches humility, presumably by stealing your hat. In some cases, model children were taken on public tours to demonstrate perfect manners. These events were oddly popular and gave rise to what one historian calls Victorian virtue pageants. Imagine standing in a stiff collar while strangers judge your ability to hand someone a biscuit gracefully. So as you sit in your little chair, back straight, mind filled with Bible verses and piano scales, you begin to realize your whole childhood is rehearsal. Rehearsal for adulthood, for respectability, for a life where spontaneous joy must always yield to social decorum. You're a tiny actor on a very rigid stage, and the audience never stops watching. And now that you're such a well-behaved little Victorian child, let's open the heavy velvet curtain on the real director of this whole etiquette theater, the church. No matter your age class or whether you prefer tea with 1 lump or 2 religion quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, shapes almost every social rule you've been trying so hard to follow. You wake up on a Sunday to the sound of bells. Church bells. They don't just signal prayer time, they announce your reputation. Everyone watches who shows up, what you wear, how punctual you are, and how many children trail behind you in matching hats. Miss a few Sundays and rumors start. Maybe you're ill, or worse, unchurched. Victorian morality is less about actual faith and more about the performance of it. Pews are packed not only with believers, but with people who fear being seen as the sort who isn't there. You could probably quote a hymn backward by now, and you're expected to. The Book of Common Prayer is basically your social passport. Now let's step into your home. It may not look like a chapel, but it sure behaves like one. The furniture chosen to reflect virtue. Upright chairs, modest fabrics, nothing too ornate unless you're aristocracy. And even then, restraint is key. Too much gold leaf, and you might as well slap nouveau riche on your forehead. If you're middle class, the goal is moral respectability. That's why your bookshelf has Pilgrim's Progress and Self-Help by Samuel Smiles. Because Victorian homes are full of sermons you don't even have to read aloud to hear. And oh, the morning customs. When someone dies, the church doesn't just guide your grief, it scripts it. Widow. You're in full mourning for 2 years. Black crepe jet jewelry and 0 social events. Caught smiling before you've shifted to half mourning. Expect raised eyebrows and whispers. Mourning isn't just personal, it's public, performative, and strictly timed. Historians still argue whether these rituals truly helped people grieve or just forced them into an emotional corset as tight as their physical ones. But the pressure wasn't all on women. Gentlemen had mourning protocols, 2 black armbands, somber hats, and no cheerful waistcoats for a decent interval. Even household objects were draped in black mirrors, covered clocks, stopped portraits veiled. Your entire reality went monochrome. Even your correspondence got a costume black-edged stationery, so every letter silently shouted, "Yes, I'm still sad." Religion also dictated your marriage, and not just in ceremony. Your choice of spouse, ideally someone from your denomination, your class, and preferably your cousin, because Victorians did love keeping things in the family. Once married, your roles were divinely assigned. Husbands lead with strength. Wives obey with grace. It's all very biblical, very structured, very trapped. For women especially, the church's shadow stretches long. Want to avoid spinsterhood? Marry early, marry right, and never complain. Want a divorce? Well, good luck. It's legal but only just, and only for men with resources. For a woman, divorce means public scandal, loss of custody, and social exile. And while historians still debate whether the rise in female institutionalization was a direct result of marital confinement, there's no denying that hysteria became a catch-all label for unhappy women. Even your body is governed by piety. Modesty isn't just preferred, it's spiritual. Exposed ankles. Risque. Cleavage scandalous. Too much rouge. Are you a woman or a walking sin? The moral police don't need badges, just pamphlets, gossip, and judgmental glances at the market. Here's a fun aside. One religious tract warned that excessive novel reading could warp the female mind and tempt her into vanity. Imagine reading Jane Eyre and immediately being suspected of moral decay. Yet another warned that dancing the waltz in particular was one step from damnation. Yes, spinning in a circle with a partner was seen as a gateway vice. No wonder Victorian parties were such tightrope acts. But don't get too gloomy, religion also offered comfort. The belief in divine order gave people a kind of cosmic script. You knew your role. You had purpose. You trusted that good behavior, even if it made you miserable, would pay off in the next life. Victorian culture made obedience not just expected, but holy. And for some, this structure genuinely worked. Philanthropy boomed under religious influence. Sunday schools taught literacy. The Salvation Army marched with purpose. And despite the repression, some reformers used Christian principles to push for abolition, prison reform, and child welfare. Morality wasn't always a cage, sometimes it was a ladder. But that ladder had rules, unspoken ones. For instance, how long should a gentleman bow when leaving church? 2 seconds is polite. 3 seconds, dignified. 4 seconds, you're either flirting or trying too hard. These kinds of micro-etiquettes were passed down like sacred lore. There were even handbooks on how to behave at a religious gathering, where to sit, how to cough, when to frown thoughtfully. There's also the quiet domestic religion of objects. Family Bibles that record generations, religious prints on parlor walls, little needlepoint samplers stitched by daughters that read things like "bless this home" or "trust and obey." They were equal parts decoration and moral reminder art with a purpose. And let's not forget religious holidays which came with their own etiquette landmines. Christmas. Yes, but no loud revelry. Easter joyful but demure. Lent 39 days of watching others break the rules while pretending you're not tempted. So as you kneel beside your bed tonight, reciting your memorized prayer, and listening to the faint creak of the house settling, you feel the weight of it all. Not just the rules of man, but the rules of heaven. The walls around you are wallpapered with faith and fear. One part comfort, one part cage. You say amen. And you hope more than anything that you did everything right today. Now that you've polished your soul for public display, let's turn to the very thing that displays you, your clothing. Because in Victorian society, you don't just wear clothes, you wear your morality, your class, your respectability, and your chances at survival. Every stitch whispers who you are. And Victorian fashion isn't just about what's in style, it's about staying in your lane. You start your day in layers. Not 2, not 3. We're talking at least 5 to 7, and that's before you even think about leaving the house. Chemise drawers, corset cover, petticoats, crinoline or bustle, depending on the decade, underskirt, overskirt, bodice, gloves, boots, hat, shawl, parasol, and that's just a weekday outfit. Dressing is practically a cardio workout, except sweat is highly discouraged and fainting is expected. That's part of the performance. And what you wear isn't about comfort. It's about decoding your role in society immediately and silently. Are you in mourning? There's a hemline and fabric for that. Are you unmarried but of marriageable age? Welcome to the world of delicate pastels and demure silhouettes. Are you a widow recently remarried? You'd better transition from full black to gray silk gradually, or the neighborhood will have opinions. It's hard to overstate just how loud Victorian fashion was in its subtleties. The direction of your bonnet ribbon could signify your marital status. The pattern on your gloves might imply your income. Historians still argue whether the elaborate women's clothing was truly a tool of patriarchal control, or whether it offered women one of the few socially accepted avenues for creative expression and upward mobility. Men's fashion had its own rigid grammar, though slightly less lethal. A gentleman's suit said everything fabric, weight, cut, number of buttons, cravat style. It was all a code. You'd never show up to dinner in a morning coat. That would be social suicide. Even your hat was an announcement. Top hats for respectability, bowlers for business, flat caps for laborers. Mix those up, and you'd either be laughed out of the club or mistaken for the help. One fun fact: there were actual books like entire manuals written to guide young ladies on how to dress properly by the hour. Not just the day. The hour. By 2 p.m., if your sleeves haven't shortened and your jewelry hasn't lightened, you're considered tragically ignorant or dangerously rebellious. But maybe the most theatrical and bizarre element of Victorian fashion, the corset. Ah, yes. The whaleboned wonder. The hourglass tyrant, the rib squisher. You squeeze into one until your waist is so unnaturally tiny, you look like an exclamation point in a hoop skirt. Some women had their ribs permanently shifted. Others simply fainted gracefully several times a day and called it glamour. Of course, you wear a corset for others as much as for yourself. A poorly laced one might suggest promiscuity or gasp poverty. And don't think men got off easy. Their own version of constriction came in the form of tightly tailored trousers and stiff shirt collars high enough to slice bread. Comfort is for the lower classes. You, my friend, must suffer tastefully. And it isn't just about what you wear, it's how you wear it. A lady never runs in a bustle. A gentleman never removes his hat indoors, unless in the presence of ladies, in which case he must. Gloves on in public, gloves off when eating, unless it's an informal lunch. In which case, you guessed it, debate persists. Victorian etiquette books often contradict each other, which adds just enough confusion to keep everyone paranoid. Now picture yourself walking into a crowded drawing room. You curtsy or bow depending on your chromosomes. You greet the hostess first, always. Your voice soft but not inaudible. Your smile modest. Your conversation about the weather. Travel art, never money illness or anything vulgar like actual feelings. All while standing like a marble statue in 20 pounds of tailored repression. Let's not forget the laundry nightmare. With so many layers, Victorian washing day was a feat of endurance. Clothes were boiled, scrubbed, wrung, and dried by hand. The wash was so intense it had its own designated day of the week, usually Monday. Women would plan their entire week around it. And yes, stains weren't just embarrassing, they were moral failings. A smudge meant you were either lazy or careless, and both were character defects. You might be wondering, did everyone follow these rules? Not quite. Working-class Victorians had their own fashion codes. Less silk, more wool. Less decoration, more durability. But they too were watched and judged. A maid caught in her employer's discarded gloves, scandal. A factory girl with a ribbon in her hair, too bright for her pay grade, harlot. It wasn't just about dressing well, it was about dressing correctly for your place. And the children, little boys, wore dresses until the age of 5. No, really. It made toilet training easier, supposedly. But it also confused burglars, which was apparently a perk. And little girls were already being trained in the art of modesty, grace, and color theory by the age of 3. Of course, Queen Victoria herself was a fashion icon, not because she dressed lavishly, but because she didn't. Her widow's weeds became a national trend. Her white wedding dress popularized the color for brides. Her strict, somber style trickled down until middle-class women everywhere were trying to copy the Queen's mourning chic. And historians still debate whether Victoria's influence helped democratize fashion or simply made emotional repression trendier. So you reach the end of another exhausting, laced-up, gloved and bonneted day. You peel off the layers one by one until you're back to your chemise, your corset, having left little angry red marks like a Victorian Yelp review across your ribs. You sigh. You've survived another day in which every choice of clothing could be a social misstep, every ruffle a risk, and every missed fashion cue a potential scandal. Good news, tomorrow you get to do it all again. With matching shoes, you're finally dressed, laced, gloved, and sufficiently respectable. But don't exhale yet. Victorian society doesn't just scrutinize what you wear, it dissects how you behave every minute of every day. Welcome to the maze of etiquette, a treacherous web of rules so dense it could rival the London fog. One misstep, and your entire social standing might collapse faster than a fainting couch beneath a hoop skirt. Let's start with the basics. You must never speak unless spoken to unless you're at a tea party, in which case small talk is permitted, but only on appropriate topics like the weather, travel, or new upholstery trends. No gossip, no politics, and heavens, no mention of bodily functions. Even saying you have a cold is vulgar. You must instead refer to it delicately as a touch of catarrh. Historians still argue whether this absurd level of euphemism was about maintaining dignity or simply a mass denial that humans have organs. And speaking of denial, you'll need to suppress a good chunk of your personality. Boisterous laughter. Unfeminine, slouching lazy. Eye contact aggressive. You smile when necessary, demur often, and sit with your ankles crossed at the right angle, not too tightly, which might imply tension, not too loosely, which might imply other things. It's not just etiquette, it's performance art. You'll also want to master the handshake hierarchy. Gentlemen might shake hands, but only if they're of equal rank. Ladies only offer your hand if you're introduced properly, and never grip too firmly, or they'll think you churn butter for fun. Worse still, you could be mistaken for American. Now imagine you're invited to dinner. Not just food, mind you, this is the event of the week, a stage upon which your refinement is judged more intensely than your roast duck. Arrive 5 minutes late, never early. Bring a calling card. Compliment the hostess, never the host. And for the love of Queen Victoria, don't mention how hungry you are. Hunger is for urchins. You are there to dine, not eat. At the table, every movement is choreographed. Soup spoon moves away from you, not toward. Bread is broken with fingers, not cut. No elbows on the table. And always, always place your napkin on your lap, not tucked into your collar, unless you wish to be mistaken for a circus act. Also, don't butter the entire slice of bread at once. That would mark you as a savage. Instead, butter one bite-sized piece at a time. Yes, it's exhausting. And yes, the bread gets cold. There's a reason etiquette manuals were bestsellers. Middle-class families clung to these rule books like holy scripture, desperate to climb the social ladder one properly timed curtsy at a time. And etiquette wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. Step out of line and you risk not just embarrassment, but social exile. Think of it like an early version of cancel culture, but with more lace and fewer memes. Now let's not forget the art of calling cards. You don't just drop by in the Victorian world. That would be barbaric. You first send your visiting card neatly printed with your full name, no nicknames allowed. Your recipient may then return one, possibly with a corner folded in a particular way to signal whether a future visit is welcome. Folded top left. Sorry, I'm not home. Folded bottom right. Please do call. Historians still debate whether this ritualized dance fostered deeper relationships or just prolonged everyone's social anxiety by a week. Of course, children were expected to follow rules as rigid as the adults. Victorian boys and girls were trained like emotional dressage horses, seen, not heard, polite, quiet, and slightly terrified. A child who failed to bow or curtsy on command was a reflection of their parents' failure. No pressure. And let's talk flirting. Oh, you can flirt. Just don't ever call it that. A dropped handkerchief, a well-timed blush, a barely audible "good day, sir" in the garden. This is Victorian courtship. A glance can carry more weight than a sonnet. Say too much and you're vulgar. say too little and you're cold. Say just the right thing, and you might be invited to take tea. Possibly in 3 months. Supervised. One quirky fact, etiquette even applied to mourning. Yes, there were rules for grief. You were expected to mourn for set periods depending on who died: 2 years for a husband, 6 months for a cousin, and so on. And your behavior had to match: no parties, no bright clothing, no smiling in public. Wearing too little black too soon was offensive. Wearing it too long meant you were just showing off. It was grief with a dress code. And while upper-class etiquette was theatrical, lower-class Victorians weren't immune. Servants were expected to master a different set of rules. Don't speak unless spoken to, don't look the master in the eye, and never ever use the front door. Break any of those and you might find yourself dismissed with a tarnished reference to boot. And in Victorian England, a poor reference could be the kiss of economic death. There were even rules for mourning pets. Yes, if your dog died, you might wear a black ribbon on your sleeve. Not doing so could imply a lack of heart. But doing it too publicly, that could suggest you valued a mutt over a human. It's a delicate balance. So you live each day as a performer in a silent opera of gestures, nods, phrasing, timing, and precisely folded napkins. You grow exhausted from scanning every room for unspoken rules, gauging the tilt of a lady's fan or the weight of a gentleman's pause before speaking. You dream in etiquette diagrams, and then you go home, unpin your hat sigh, and wonder what it must feel like to just say what you think. Maybe even scratch your nose in public. But no, you'll save that for the next life. One without calling cards. Just when you think you've mastered the etiquette labyrinth, another invisible force tightens its grip your neighbors. In Victorian life, the eyes on the street don't just watch. They judge, speculate, and occasionally ruin you with a single raised eyebrow. Welcome to the age of reputation, where every curtain is a surveillance camera and every tea break is a tribunal in disguise. You live not only in your home but also in the minds of everyone on your block. A missed church service. They'll assume you've taken ill or worse, become irreligious. A louder than usual piano practice, clearly a sign of instability. The butcher's boy stops twice in a week. There are rumors now. Historians still argue whether this hyper-awareness made communities stronger or just more creatively paranoid. But it's not just idle gossip. In a society where women can't vote, inherit property easily, or hold office, your reputation becomes your currency. For young women especially, a single scandal, real or invented, can make marriage prospects vanish like mist over the Thames. A walk without a chaperone, a letter from a gentleman, even laughing too loudly in public could raise suspicions. And once your name is spoiled, it takes Herculean effort and a well-placed marriage to scrub it clean. So you police yourself. But more often, you police others. You watch the neighbors as they watch you. That widow down the lane, was that a male visitor? The Jenkins boy has muddy shoes. Again, is he being neglected? And Mrs. Chalmers, she's been visiting her sister for 5 weeks. You suspect no sister exists, but you say nothing. Just a look perhaps over your spectacles. Victorian moral surveillance even had an architectural expression, the terraced house with its identical frontages and narrow facades. These were design choices with behavioral expectations baked in. Don't hang laundry on Sundays. Don't sweep the stoop at the wrong hour. Don't paint your door a bold color that might suggest radicalism. Even the tiniest deviation, a loud laugh, a too friendly nod marks you as off, and so you follow the rhythm of respectable life. You open your curtains at the socially accepted hour. Too early is desperate. Too late is slovenly. You display modest potted plants in your window, not extravagant, just cheerful. No orchids. Orchids are suggestive. You greet passers-by with the appropriate nod, not too friendly. You're not French, but not cold. You're not Scottish. And above all, you avoid drawing attention. Because attention invites speculation, and speculation is Victorian poison. Let's say you've just hosted a tea gathering. You offered cucumber sandwiches, kept your pinky discreetly in line, and ensured the conversation never strayed beyond weather and wallpaper. Success, right? Maybe. But your guests are walking home now, and already comparing your biscuits to Mrs. Woodley's from last week. A bit dry, weren't they? And her silver looked a touch tarnished. She said toilet instead of lavatory, can you imagine? One fringe tidbit. There were etiquette manuals that included diagrams of acceptable lady laughter. Anything too open-mouthed was considered crass. You were advised to smile and emit a soft exhale just enough to suggest amusement, not bodily function. Try that next time you're genuinely tickled. Victorian restraint even extended to mirth. And if you think men had it easier, think again. A man in Victorian society was expected to present an image of integrity, control, and financial stability. If he laughed too hard, cried openly, or worse, showed romantic vulnerability. Scandalous. Even wearing the wrong style of hat could hint at political leanings or class pretensions. And forget crying in public, unless your monarch dies. Then it's permitted briefly. But nowhere is surveillance stronger than in small towns. In London, you might vanish into the fog. In a village, you are the news. Your every movement is noted, discussed, archived in memory for the next Sunday's walk and whisper. She wears gloves even to the bakery. I heard she reads novels in the afternoon. The horror. Of course, not everyone obeys. There are rebels, quiet and otherwise. The painter who grows his hair too long. The widow who wears violet too soon. The spinster who speaks of suffrage and Darwin. They are fascinating and frightening. You wouldn't invite them for dinner, but you would watch. From your parlor, through lace curtains. Historians still argue whether this constant vigilance preserved a certain moral standard or simply created a brittle performance-based society where authenticity had to be hidden in private diaries behind locked drawers. And let's talk about anonymous letters. Yes, people wrote unsigned notes to neighbors pointing out infractions. Your hedges are overgrown. Your maid used the front door. The music from your parlor suggests intemperance. Sometimes the messages were charitable, sometimes cruel. But always they reinforced the notion that your life was being audited by unseen hands. The obsession with social surveillance even reached schools. Children were trained to report improper behavior. Not in a spy-like way. No, this was framed as moral guardianship. Tell us if your classmate writes with their left hand. Inform us if anyone doodles angels with bare ankles. Yes, even angels needed proper hosiery. This wasn't just Victorian England. It was a collective performance on the grandest stage imaginable. And like any performance, there were critics, whisper campaigns, and sudden, brutal, career-ending reviews. The penalty, social death, exclusion. A life of being nodded at, coldly pitied in church pews, and whispered about in drawing rooms with just enough volume for you to overhear. and so you remain constantly attuned to your environment. Your words, your walk, your wardrobe, your window box, all curated with quiet fear. There's no rest. Even silence must be the right kind of silence. You want to scream, but even that would be socially improper. By now, you're likely clutching your teacup with white knuckles, wondering how anyone made it through a single Victorian week without collapsing under the weight of all that etiquette and judgment. But here's the twist: you weren't even trusted to navigate it alone. Enter the etiquette manuals, your heavy, ever-judging, frilly-paged life coaches. You might think today's self-help books and advice columns are intense, but Victorian etiquette guides were in a league of their own. There was one for every conceivable moment of existence. The habits of good society, the laws of etiquette, Manners for Men, the Lady's Guide to Perfect Gentility, all waiting on your bookshelf like polite little landmines. And you were expected to read them closely, possibly aloud to your daughters, with gloves on. They dictated everything from how to decline a dance, never outright. Only I regret I am already engaged for this waltz, to how to hold a calling card between the forefinger and thumb with precisely no flourish. If you thought you could freestyle a conversation, think again. Even small talk had rules. Avoid discussing religion, politics, illness, or your husband's trousers. You laugh, but it's in the book. One mainstream historical fact: Victorian etiquette wasn't just about niceties, it was a form of social control. These books were moral instruction disguised as charm school. Follow the rules and you might be accepted into polite society. Slip once and you risked being marked as vulgar, the Victorian kiss of death. And who wrote these manuals? Often middle-class authors climbing the ladder themselves, eager to show they knew how things should be done. Think of them as 19th century influencers with feathered quills. They shaped behavior, fashion, even morality itself. Want a quirky tidbit? One etiquette guide specifically forbade women from adjusting their shawls in public, claiming it suggested a lack of internal discipline. Yes, apparently your moral compass is directly linked to your scarf positioning. You're expected to internalize all of it. Which fork is for fish, how many minutes to wait before accepting tea, never rush, how to descend a staircase sideways. If you're a lady with eyes slightly lowered to project modesty, and how to greet someone depending on their rank, time of day, and humidity level. Okay, maybe not the weather, but honestly, it wouldn't surprise you. Even the tone of your thank you note mattered. Too formal, you seemed cold. Too casual, you were a clown. Too emotional, you were French. And that simply wouldn't do. Historians still argue whether these manuals truly reflected the way people behaved, or whether they were more like aspirational fantasies, Victorian Pinterest boards full of impossible life goals. Either way, you lived in their shadow. Etiquette rules also had gender expectations baked in like lard in a Victorian pudding. Men were to be gallant, steady, and always in control of their temper. Women delicate, passive, and in eternal fear of offending someone with an improperly lowered eyelid. A lady's handshake, by the way, was not recommended. Too forward. A slight bow of the head would do anything more suggested you were headed for the stage. Or worse, the suffrage movement. And remember your staff. Even your treatment of servants had guidelines not designed to protect the staff, mind you, but to protect your image. A polite mistress was expected to scold her maid only in private, and only with language appropriate to scripture. Throwing objects, poor form. Public reprimands, a scandal waiting to happen. But forget about equality. Servants had their own etiquette manuals too, explaining how to respond to a bell within 4 seconds and how to back out of a room without causing audible rustling. One particularly absurd rule involved glove etiquette. Gloves weren't just fashion, they were metaphors for your moral hygiene. You wore them nearly everywhere, changed them constantly, and were judged fiercely if they appeared worn, stained, or heaven forbid, unbuttoned. There was a protocol for removing your gloves in company. Do it slowly, left hand first, fingers outward, never tug. Tugging was for sailors and people without reputations. And heaven help you if you accidentally touched someone with a bare hand. That level of skin-on-skin intimacy was reserved for marriage or fainting episodes. You begin to see how exhausting it is. Life becomes a non-stop performance with your body, words, and thoughts all needing constant choreography. Even letters had rules about ink color, black or blue-black, only fold direction, and envelope sealing methods. Red sealing wax, too passionate. Pink, too flirtatious. Blue, you're clearly trying to show off that you holiday in Nice. Even your mourning had a manual. There were rules for how long to mourn your parents, a year and a day, your spouse 2 years, and your second cousin twice removed. Honestly, just look sad at church. Mourning fashion was a booming industry, crepe jet jewelry, and entire shops dedicated to stylish sadness. And yes, there was even a correct depth of veil darkness depending on your grief level. So what happens if you mess up? Let's say you accidentally butter your bread with the meat knife. That's it. You've ruined Christmas. People will speak of it for decades in whispers. Do you remember when Miss Lyle used the wrong blade? It becomes a family legend told with shaking heads over brandy. But etiquette did evolve sometimes in absurd directions. Late in the century, some books suggested that hosts begin labeling their forks, since guests were becoming increasingly flustered by buffet-style dining. Picture your next dinner party. Please use the salmon fork tagged in lilac, and not the sardine fork dotted in green. And no, those are not made up. Etiquette was supposed to offer stability, a moral compass in uncertain times. But it often just reinforced class divides, gender roles, and social anxiety. It taught you that being correct mattered more than being kind, that silence was better than honesty, that the appearance of virtue trumped the practice of it, and so you play along. You rehearse your lines, polish your spoons, and pray your hat angle is just so. You don't dare sneeze during grace laugh during a eulogy or faint without a handkerchief in hand. Because in Victorian society, etiquette wasn't just how you behaved. It was who you were. At this point, you're probably thinking, okay, maybe if I stayed quiet, followed the etiquette manuals, curtsied in my sleep, and avoided scandal like it was the plague I could scrape by in Victorian society. But there's a final crushing truth you haven't quite faced yet. Your entire life is one massive, rigid social audition. And no matter how perfectly you perform, your class still defines your ceiling. Victorian England wasn't just about rules, it was about rank. Everyone had their place, and God forbid you forgot yours. Whether you were a duchess or a dairymaid, a merchant or a matchstick girl, society had expectations for you, and you strayed at your own peril. You're not just judged for how you act. You're judged for where you're standing while you do it. Born working class, you might bathe twice a week, speak the Queen's English, and say pardon instead of what, but you'll still be seen as second-rate. Social mobility, more fantasy than fact. Let's begin with a mainstream historical truth. Victorian England was officially obsessed with classification. Every census sermon and school book came with reminders of your proper place. Even Darwin's Origin of Species was twisted to support the idea that the upper class was somehow more evolved. Neat trick that. Now imagine your everyday life filtered through this. Your clothes tailored for your class. Literally. A lady's fashion would bankrupt a milliner's apprentice. A servant's uniform made sure you were always visible as other. Even your walking route was class-coded. Working-class girls took the back alleys. The wealthy promenaded through parks. Crossing into the wrong zone made you suspicious. The homes reflected too. Rich townhouses boasted drawing rooms, smoking rooms, music parlors, and of course servant quarters, which were below naturally. Poorer families sometimes lived 5 to a room in damp tenements, with outdoor privies and a view of someone else's laundry line. So if you were hoping for your own scented boudoir with lace-trimmed pillows, tough luck, try a straw mattress next to your grandmother and 2 coughing siblings. Historians still argue whether the so-called middle-class explosion in the 19th century was true upward mobility, or just an illusion padded with debt and bone china. Sure, more people got to wear waistcoats and own pianos, but did they really escape the working-class mindset, or were they just better at faking gentility? One delightfully quirky tidbit: some upwardly mobile families rented fake bookcases to look intellectual, despite not being able to read Latin titles. Imagine trying to impress guests while praying they don't pull down your hollow edition of Plato's Republic and reveal it's a biscuit tin. And let's talk about speech. A misplaced vowel could blow your cover. The so-called dropped H was a dead giveaway, saying ouse instead of house could mark you as a gutter rat faster than scuffed boots. Elocution teachers became minor celebrities, teaching the rising class how to sound rich. Cue montage of you whispering, "How now, brown cow in a freezing attic." Then there was the marriage market. If you were poor, marriage was often about survival. If you were rich, it was about alliances. If you were in between, welcome to the world of calculated courtships. Middle-class girls were raised to marry up, but not so far up as to seem presumptuous. And heaven forbid a lower-class man fell for a factory heiress. His love would be deemed social climbing, and her reputation would wither like a neglected fern. Speaking of ferns, yes, those leafy green things, Victorians had a class-coded obsession with them. The upper crust adored exotic plants as a status symbol. Poorer folks might adopt a single fern in a cracked pot, hoping it made their parlor seem posher. Entire etiquette sections were written on how to arrange plants in a genteel home. Imagine trying to impress your neighbors with the correct botanical aesthetic. You're not just picking foliage, you're curating your soul. And don't forget philanthropy. If you were middle or upper class, you were expected to give to the poor, but with the right level of pity, never solidarity. Charity was a performance. You gave coins at Christmas, maybe adopted a chimney sweep's daughter for moral rehabilitation, but never ever let her sit at your table. You can be kind, but not equal. Your job options were also locked behind your social station. A working-class woman might become a seamstress, a laundress, or a maid. A middle-class one, a governess if she had education and nerves of steel. An upper-class lady. No work at all, thank you very much. Just embroidery, charity teas, and the occasional tragic piano recital. Even leisure was classified. The rich attended the opera. The middle class might afford a night at the theater. The poor stood in the gallery cheering the villain and dodging ceiling plaster. And everyone knew exactly who belonged in each row. Worse still, even your suffering was ranked. A poor widow was a statistic. A grieving countess made the society pages. When a child died in a slum, no one raised an eyebrow. But if a baron's heir fell ill, prayers were said across counties. Injustice wore a cravat and knew how to sip sherry without slurping. Still want to beat the system? Good luck. Victorians loved a good rags to riches story, but only if the hero remained humble, religious, and endlessly grateful to their betters. No loud ambitions, no dreams of true equality, just a nice rise into quiet servitude. By now you're exhausted. You've memorized forks, muffled sneezes, danced with dukes, feigned delight at cold ham, and smiled through 3 petticoats of repression. But here's the kicker, none of it truly makes you free. Because in the end, what you do matters less than who people think you are. And in the Victorian world, that's determined not by your character, but by your class. Now take a deep breath, because we've reached the final act. You've survived corsets, calling cards, soup spoons, gossip, gauntlets, and the crushing thumb of class hierarchy. But there's one last detail no one warns you about until it's too late. Every single one of those rules follows you, even into the grave. Welcome to the final social performance Victorian death. And believe me, it's just as obsessed with etiquette as every other moment of life. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. Victorians were fixated on death, not just as a tragic end, but as a solemn art form. Mourning was choreographed down to the minute. There were mourning clothes, mourning jewelry, mourning stationery. Yes, even your letters had to look sad. You, dear listener, don't get to simply pass away quietly in a feather bed. No, you must die with dignity, be mourned with restraint, and leave behind a wardrobe of jet black crepe that no one can afford. If your mother dies, that's 2 years in deep mourning. Your cousin may be just a black armband. But woe betide the woman who wears lavender too soon. It signals you're eager to move on. Scandalous. And should you be the one to die, well, your family better follow the script. You need an obituary in the paper, a funeral procession with just the right number of carriages, and if you're wealthy enough, a life-size marble angel to sob eternally over your plot. If you're poor, it might be a wooden box and a walk to the nearest mass grave. Dying respectfully costs money, you see. One quirky tidbit that perfectly sums up the era: Victorians took mourning photographs, portraits of the dead dressed up and posed like they were still alive. Often families would prop up a deceased child with siblings and paint on pupils afterwards so they'd look spirited. A bit macabre, yes, but it was considered loving. There's even an entire subgenre of Victorian photography dedicated to these eerie last snapshots. Your mourning outfit must match your station. Upper-class women wore dresses entirely of black crepe, including gloves, hat veils, and bonnets. No shiny buttons or jewelry unless it was jet, the only acceptable material for the first year of grief. Men predictably just wore a black suit, convenient. Historians still argue whether Victorian mourning culture was a genuine expression of grief or more of a moral performance, another arena where the pious could prove their discipline. Was it healing ritual or performative penance? And there were rules for mourning behavior too. No parties, no music, no laughing in public, no colorful flowers. Children were taught to suppress levity. If you accidentally chuckled at a funeral, you could be labeled disrespectful or unchristian. Imagine bottling your tears and jokes for a full calendar year. Emotion was allowed, but only in very tasteful, controlled sobs. Of course, class dictated the whole affair. The rich had fancy wakes, hearse horses in black velvet, even hired mourners to cry convincingly. The poor scraped together coins for a simple pine coffin. Some charitable organizations offered paupers' funerals, and if you were lucky, you got your own grave. If not, you'd be layered in with strangers, each in a rented slot. Oh, and should someone die in the home, you must cover all the mirrors immediately. Souls were believed to get trapped in reflections. Clocks were stopped at the hour of death, curtains drawn, and the body laid out in the parlor for viewing. That's right. Your living room becomes a temporary shrine of grief. And yes, even your pets might wear mourning ribbons. If Lady Bellington's lapdog lost his master, the poor Pomeranian was draped in black silk. Nothing says emotional repression like accessorizing your chihuahua with sorrow. Let's say you were clever enough to escape poverty. In life, death may still drag you back. Victorian burial clubs, basically early funeral insurance, let the working class pay monthly to avoid disgrace at the end. But if you missed a few payments, sorry. No gravestone, no procession. Just a patch of dirt and forgotten sorrow. Even cemeteries were class segregated. The grandest plots in London's Highgate Cemetery featured crypts, statues, and iron gates. The working poor had the common ground often unmarked and eventually reused, literally erased from memory. And if you were female, your widowhood had expectations. You must appear broken, subdued, perpetually draped in black. If you remarried too quickly, whispers followed. If you stayed single too long, people wondered if you secretly enjoyed your husband's passing. Either way, your grief had a shelf life and a script, but it wasn't all grim. Some Victorians found genuine meaning in the rituals. The act of mourning became a comfort proof that a life was cherished. Grief wasn't hidden away. It was worn, lived in, acknowledged. It could make you feel close to the departed. In a time before grief therapy or Instagram tributes, this was how they made sense of loss. So here you are. You've endured the rules of birth, courtship, marriage, dinner class, dress, and now, even death. You've danced the cotillion, trimmed the crusts, learned to faint properly in a corset, and still the game never ends. Because in Victorian England, your life isn't your own, it's society's performance, and you're expected to stick to the script until the final curtain call. And as you lie in your satin-lined coffin, hopefully not too flashy, hopefully not too plain, you might be remembered fondly, or judged forever for wearing amethyst too soon after your aunt's demise. Word count 182. Wind down below. Wind down 300 words. So now just lie back. The last gas lamp flickers. The footsteps on the cobblestones fade away. You've done it. You've played every part, remembered every line, endured every rule Victorian society could throw at you. You've pressed lace to your lips in silent grief, sipped lukewarm tea at the appropriate angle, and resisted the primal urge to just, scream into your pillow about how exhausting it all is. But there's peace in that too, in knowing how far we've come, in realizing that behind all the velvet and starch, people were just people trying to make sense of a chaotic world with etiquette manuals and black crepe. Let your breathing slow. No more scrutiny. No more rules. No one is watching now. The curtains are drawn. The mourning veil lifts. Somewhere a clock ticks gently, not out of obligation, but just because it can. You've survived the season, the gossip, the corsets, the coal dust, the crushing weight of status and expectation. And now you're finally free to exhale. Let your limbs grow heavy, your thoughts softer. The world outside fades into mist. And maybe, just maybe, the only real rule that matters is rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.